Hey everybody, it is Mike Schumann and Seth Tao here for another episode of East 17th Street, a podcast by the Daily Hoosier. And we are back once again, building momentum, I would even say, on our endeavor to talk about one opponent and one position group for the 2025 IU football season. Today's topic, as you can see if you're watching on YouTube, is the Oregon Ducks and the Indiana tight ends. And Seth, starting with Oregon, I think similar to our conversation yesterday, talking about Iowa, the number one thing when you talk about going out to Eugene to play a football game is that you're going out to a really tough environment. And it's really interesting. I meant to look this up before we started for exact numbers. I'll do it while I'm talking here. But Oregon's stadium capacity is in the 50s. I know that. Which is not dissimilar to Indiana's. 54,000 is exactly how it's listed, but it has a national reputation as one of the toughest places to play in the country. Why do you think that is? It just as a fan of the sport. We've got the image up here on YouTube. I don't see like any acoustic designs. I guess when I'm out there in October, I'll try to find secrets. Maybe they pump noise into the stands. I don't know, but Oregon seems Oregon seems to be a very tough place for opposing teams to go to.
Yeah, I mean, crowd noise or crowd size may not always be everything. Obviously, I mean, you would, if you're setting a noise point spread, you would favor a stadium that has 100,000 versus one that has 50,000. But I mean,
Sure.
if you're comparing some of the, mid-tier Big Ten schools that may have 70,000 or, in the 60,000s to something like that, I mean, the difference there between 10, 15,000 fans, might not matter as much in terms of the noise when you have a program that's been as consistently successful as Oregon has over the years. And I mean, when you're good for a long time, it just leads to a lot of fan support and a good home field environment.
So I think maybe what you're suggesting, and I would agree, is that it's not just the number of fans; it's how much energy they bring.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think it almost builds on itself. Like the Oregon becomes known as a place that's tough to play, and the fans buy into that, and like, okay, we'll continue to make it a tough place to play. Headlining or illustrating that fact is the fact that Oregon beat Ohio State last year in Eugene, and the Buckeyes, of course, went on to win the national title. But Oregon is the defending Big Ten champion. How about this? Their first season in the Big Ten, they go undefeated and win the title. Welcome to the league. That I think that's kind of an untold or underappreciated story, at least back here in the middle of the country and the East Coast, is the fact that Oregon came into this daunting conference and pulled that off in year one. It was a very impressive accomplishment.
I mean, that may have gotten more pub if, one of the teams they beat out for that title didn't go on and win the whole big
Sure.
thing.
Yep. Yep. And they did end up losing to Ohio State in the playoffs in very convincing fashion. So I think that kind of undermined their story as well. And as they turn the page into year two in the Big Ten, I think as we're probably doing in every case, because I think it's just where you have to start when you look at a high major college football team is quarterback. And they've got a major loss there with Dylan Gabriel moving on, and in my opinion, a pretty significant question mark in terms of are they going to get anywhere close to the same caliber of quarterback play that they had with Gabriel, and if not, like how many rungs does that bring them down?
Yeah, you're right. Quarterback is one of the biggest questions on this Oregon roster with Dante Moore stepping into that. He didn't really play much last season, obviously, because Gabriel, was the man for Oregon last year. He started a little bit at UCLA in 2023 and was pretty unremarkable, you'd say, in that run. I mean, obviously, he wasn't lighting it up enough to win the job outright out there, and he was kind of splitting time with one of their other guys, and ended up at Oregon last year. Is set to start this year, and Yeah, it's a big question because it look, I mean, they're going to have a level of confidence to be able to roll them out there for as your starting quarterback. I mean, obviously there's got to be some sort of belief in there, but at least based on the track record, it is a big question mark. And I guess what you can really say is that for a team like that's going to be built like Oregon, like the best teams in the country, you may not need top of the line quarterback play. I mean, no disrespect when I say this to Will Howard, about Will Howard in Ohio State last year. You wouldn't say that Will Howard was the best quarterback in the Big Ten last year. You wouldn't say he was probably a top 20 quarterback in the country last year. But when you have a roster that was built like Ohio State's, you don't necessarily need it. You kind of just need somebody to keep the ship steered straight and keep things moving along. And if Oregon's roster is going to be as strong as everybody, on the whole, as everybody believes, that might be all you really need out of their quarterback. You may just need, you may just need a game manager type of quarterback, somebody that is going to keep you in the game, maybe not make all the big plays and put himself in the Heisman conversation, but just somebody that can keep the ship steered straight.
I mean, it's a fair point. I would say, just given Will Howard's complete body of work last year, including the playoff, including how clutch he seemed to be, I would maybe take a little bit of issue with how you characterize him, but nevertheless, I think the point stands. But it does go to Oregon. I'm looking at your analysis of them on the Daily Hoosier. Returning production on offense is only 40%. And so it does leave you wondering. And by the way, that's Bill Connolly of ESPN's returning production. And when he does that, he factors in transfers. So that's suggesting that 60% of their starters this year are going to be guys that really don't have a lot of experience as starters. So that almost implies that you need a quarterback who can do a little bit more than maybe just a game manager.
Yeah. And I didn't mean to pigeonhole Will Howard, or like I said, I didn't mean to, mischaracterize his obviously big impact on Ohio State. But yeah, they do. Like I wrote in here, they only have one offensive player back from last season who started more than half their games, and that's their center. And they have a few other guys that started maybe 5 games, maybe 6 games. Obviously, they played more. They played what, 14 games last year because they went to the conference title game and then had a playoff game. So they played 14 games last year. You may have somebody that started 5 games or 6 games, and I do think also with the returning production percentage, I think losing your quarterback, I have to imagine, weighs pretty heavily into that equation, just because, when you lose your obviously as important a quarterback as important a position as quarterback is. And when you only really have one guy playing that the whole year, when you lose that, I mean, you're just going to lose so much more production there than you do when you see a, receiver that caught, 50 for 600 yards or whatever. When you see somebody like that go, you're just going to, the quarterback is just going to weigh heavier into that equation, I have to figure. They do have a lot of turnover, but there's a lot of, I would say in general, the offense is a bigger question mark for Oregon than the defense is. But I mean, there's still a lot of talent on the roster.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I just think, they're going to need Dante Moore to show a lot more than he has to this point. Obviously, looking at the numbers you posted, 53% completion percentage and 11 touchdowns to 9 interceptions. If I were an Oregon fan, a casual Oregon fan, and didn't really know much about the guy, I think I'd be going into this season a little bit uncomfortable with what he's posted to this point in his career, despite the fact that he was a 5-star recruit.
You're not wrong there. But again, on the other side of that, he's probably going to have one of the better receiving cores that he's had. I think Oregon's receiving core is going to be far better than what he had at UCLA. I mean, the true freshman Jacorian Moore comes in as the number 4 overall player in the class, and he kind of seems like a Jeremiah Smith kind of guy who could make that kind of impact. I think, especially just given what he did as a true freshman last year, I think everybody's going to be looking at this guy Jacorian Moore to have a similar impact. And I mean, they've got some other promising pieces, Gary Bryant Jr., Malik Benson, but I think especially with a high touted player like Moore or Decory and Moore, I guess there's two Moores. when you have a highly touted receiver like Decory and Moore, it's just a night and day difference maker with what compared to what he was working with at UCLA.
Yeah, they did lose one of their top receivers. I say top. I can't say that definitively. Maybe Evan Stewart over the course of the summer looks like he's going to miss significant time with a knee injury. So they did take a hit there. I think one of the things you have to consider is the staff here. I mean, I think Dan Lanning and his staff, Lanning comes from an impressive pedigree that goes back to Alabama and a lot of time at Georgia. And now, I think year 4 as a head coach, if I'm thinking about it right. And building a reputation as a guy who has a lot of success with quarterbacks as well, in addition to, time with Kirby Smart and others. So, I think it's becoming reasonable to think that quarterbacks are going to thrive under him, and we are going to see development. And Indiana fans should not be taking solace in my tone that Oregon is ripe for an upset this year. Although I think, relative to last year, I think you'd rather be going out there in 2025.
We haven't really talked about Oregon's running game as well.
Yeah.
They added one of the top running backs in the country from last season, Mekhi Hughes from Tulane. So he was 10th in the nation with 1,401 yards on 265 carries, 15 touchdowns. I mean, if you're rushing for almost 5.3 yards per carry on that big of a workload, that's really impressive.
Yep, no doubt about it. You mentioned the defense, 45% returning production. I noticed yesterday, I think it's going to be an interesting underlying storyline for this game. One of the stars of their team, no doubt, is a defensive end whose name I'm going to butcher, Mateo Ugalele, maybe?
I'm assuming it's Ugalele, like the former Clemson, Florida State, all those other places quarterback.
Wiga makes sense. I'll go with that. He got AP All-American nod at defensive end, and Mikhail Kamara did not. So that's going to be an interesting storyline. I think those guys are probably your preseason first team All Big Ten defensive ends, if I'm not mistaken. Might be leaving somebody out there, but he's probably the best player on this defense, is he not?
I mean, it's probably either him or another familiar name to Indiana fans, Dylan Thieneman, the Purdue transfer at safety.
Yep. Fair point. I'm always cautious about safeties who rack up big tackle numbers. In my mind, that's a sign of a bad defense, which he was part of. So it'll be interesting to see how he performs at Oregon. I'm not suggesting he's a bad player. I'm just suggesting if you're looking at his tackle production and thinking, oh, there's a good player, it might just be more that he was cleaning up a lot of messes.
Well, I'm pretty sure he also got AP, a preseason All-American
I think you're right.
recognition at safety. So, I mean, I think a lot of people are expecting big things and expecting a seamless transition, we should say.
Yeah, he was definitely a big kid. I know he was really coveted out of the portal when he left Purdue, and I remember him as a freshman against Indiana. I think he had 2 interceptions, if I'm not mistaken, and he's been just a high production player. I'm kidding a little bit about the tackles, but I think he was definitely a big addition, and they definitely have some impressive pieces. As I think about this game, I'm reminded a little bit about how I felt about Michigan a year ago, and from the standpoint of this feels like more gettable than normal. Like if I remember thinking, Michigan coming off a national title, little hungover, coaching change, questionable questions at quarterback. It felt gettable. This one does as well, but Indiana, as we've already covered, is going to be coming off 2 really tough games, Illinois and then at Iowa. They will have a bye week before this game, which I think should help them quite a bit in a number of respects. I suspect they'll probably travel. I don't know. Sig likes to keep his travel schedule consistent. So I was going to say they might travel out there early just to get acclimated to the time change, but I might have to correct myself midstream on that and say no, they'll probably go out late Friday night and try to be in Eugene as little as possible. I don't know, but I definitely think it helps them to have a bye week going into this game.
Yeah, for sure. And something else worth noting is that Fernando Mendoza has played out in Eugene before. He was at Cal, obviously, before Indiana, and Cal joined the ACC last year, but he was playing for Cal in their final year with the Pac-12, and he played at Oregon that year. And that game was pretty ugly and probably one he's going to want to forget. But there's something to be said for what like we talked about before, it can be kind of an intimidating environment for having been there before and kind of knowing what to expect.
Yeah, no doubt. So I'm feeling a little bit of an itchy trigger finger to make a call on there, but I'm gonna let it go at least until our predictions show in a week or so. And before I say anything I regret, we'll move on to the tight ends. And I think is one of the more interesting rooms on the IU offense from the standpoint that it just feels a little bit different to me this year. Um, I asked Signetti I think it was going into spring practice, and I asked too soon and might ask again next week if he felt like he had a vertical threat in the tight end room. He wasn't ready to answer it, understandably, because he hadn't really seen any practices at all to that point. But watching Holden Stays, looking at Holden Stays, I think they have a different element in the tight end this room. He stands out to me. I'm talking about Tennessee transfer. He stands out to me as somebody that you just see him at practice. He's 6'5", looks like just a classic vertical downhill tight end, and I think he's going to bring something different to this offense this year.
Absolutely. I mean, it's been interesting kind of watching him in practice because it's the player that we see in Holden Stays in practice. It's strange that he hasn't put up bigger numbers, earlier in his college career, because he looks like a guy that could, come in. He looks like he's had good hands. He's a big dude that can take a hit and keep running. He's, looks like a guy that could really make some plays in the receiving game for Indiana. But I mean, the numbers haven't really been there for him in his college career. But here's the thing, like, Indiana, with the way they use their tight end spot, I mean, Zach Horton last year put up 189 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns. And, obviously it was really important in the blocking game. And we'll get to the blocking aspect of the tight end room later. But, I mean, he still felt, you still felt like Horton was a pretty reliable target in the red zone for Curtis Rourke last year.
Right.
And if that's all you really need out of your tight end in this offense, I mean, at Notre Dame in 2023, Holden Stace finished with 176 yards and 4 touchdowns. And it's like, that's not far. It's, if all you need from Holden Stace is to replicate the receiving impact of Zach Horton, I don't think he'll have any problem doing that. I think there's a lot of scenarios where he's able to eclipse the receiving aspect, the receiving impact of Zach Horton last year.
Yeah, and I suspect some of it is just the way different coaching staffs utilize tight ends. It's so disparate across offenses that and you see really talented guys not necessarily put up big numbers in college and get drafted in the NFL, just kind of highlighting their talent. It happened with AJ Barner at Michigan. I don't think he had a especially massive season after he transferred from IU to Michigan, but people saw 6'6" dude that could that was fast and could make plays down the field, and that was a draftable quality. So I think Stace has that. I don't know that I want to necessarily sit here and say he's going to post 500 yards and 10 touchdowns or anything like that, but even if he's like kind of taking the top off the defense and opening things up for everybody else, that's just as valuable.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and we talked yesterday about how, loaded Indiana's receiver room is, and there's going to be a lot of competition for targets, throughout games, throughout, series, throughout drives, on individual plays. It's difficult to tell, who's going to be, leading the way in terms of targets, who's going to become like the kind of the security blankets within the offense. But I mean, Holden Stace absolutely has the potential to be that kind of guy.
And Mendoza, I'm going to forget the guy's name, but his tight end last year at Cal, he did, it seems like if it's left to him, he did favor the tight end position. He does look at that the way a lot. Might have had a little bit to do with him being under pressure so much. I don't know exactly the details there, but just pointing out that from a Mendoza standpoint, he went to the tight end heavily last year.
Yeah, I've got that in front of me. Jack Endries was the kid's name, and he was Cal's leading receiver last year. 56 catches, 623 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And look, I don't think any of us would sit here and say the Holden Stace is going to be that this year.
Right.
I think Indiana's receiving room is going to have a lot more potential than what you saw over at Cal last year. But I mean, I think, like I said, I think it's reasonable to expect Holden Stace to at least match what Zach Horton did in the receiving game last year. And I think it's not unreasonable to expect him to exceed it.
Yeah, I would agree. And then, the other key addition from the transfer portal, I think it's pretty impressive haul for Indiana. 2 Power 4 veteran additions, the other being Riley Nowakowski from Wisconsin, former walk-on at Wisconsin, just like Drew Evans. They were walk-ons together at Wisconsin. Pretty fascinating guy to listen, talk to. I suggest people, if you didn't watch his press conference last week, you go back and do it. He's clearly a bright guy that has a lot of interesting things to say about Signetti and other topics. So interesting guy, but he seems to be of the Zach Horton mold much more so, and in fact I think played fullback early on in his career, as Horton ironically is now playing in the NFL, at least at times, for the Detroit Lions in their camp this month. So I guess the question on Nowakowski is, can he fill the Horton role from a blocking standpoint, which I do think was Zach's probably biggest strength.
I think you take a look at him on the field, and I say this kind of thing a lot, like he certainly looks the part. Like it's not like they're putting he's a big dude. I mean, he's the offensive line. Fernando Mendoza took the offensive line out for a steak dinner a couple weeks ago, and Nowakowski was included with that group, and it didn't feel like he was out of place. So, he's that type of blocker and viewed as that type of blocker within the locker room, clearly. Now, I will say he's sound in pass protection in terms of the way he graded. I recall maybe a little bit of concern in the run block just based off of the grades last year. But I mean, I think Indiana, at least system wise, looks like they have the pieces in place to kind of set him up to be successful in the run blocking and set him up. And like I said, he's already sound in pass protection, and he plays with a physicality that you really want in that type of role, in a blocking tight end or a fullback sort of role.
Yeah, Nowakowski's a 6th-year guy, stays a senior. So those are just, high quality veteran additions. And, kind of as I was suggesting yesterday, I think at the minimum, this room is at least where it was last year. I would even argue this is one of the examples where, all due respect to Zach Horton, who I think was a very underappreciated player on last year's team, I think the room as a whole has probably taken a step forward. The only player who's back from the room from last year, ironically, is James Bamba. I think he's also a 5th-year player, so you got a lot of veterans at the top of the depth chart there. I think he's a guy that will play. I think it's more probably spot duty or specific roles, specific formation groups, things like that. But I think he will play. I think he's got really good size. He's probably around 6'6", and I see a role for him, but he's probably got a lot to overcome to knock Stays and Nowakowski from the primary duties.
Yeah, absolutely. And to what you said about, the room, this year compared to last year, I think the main difference I feel like is maybe fair or unfair. It feels like the room is not as deep as it was last year. And that might just be because, you basically have two players that are trying to, fill both of the roles that Zach Horton held last year. You have Stace as the receiver, you have Nowakowski as the blocker. Horton was pretty much both of those guys last year. So it's kind of two guys filling one role. And when you look at the room last year, I mean, you had Trey Walker that was getting some action. You had James Bomba would see the field, and even behind them, I was always high on the future potential for Sam West, who there were three
Mm-hmm.
tight ends that transferred out, and he was the only one that landed at a Power 4 school at Mississippi State. So maybe I was onto something there, but what that something is, I don't know. But but you have Stace and you have Nowakowski, and then you have James Bomba, but otherwise you're looking at two true freshmen. And I think that it's tricky because I think Holden Stace could, hold up probably fine enough in blocking, but he's not a guy that you really want. You would much rather have Nowakowski doing the blocking.
Right.
And from everything you see, I mean, it's not like Nowakowski isn't like catching passes in practice or anything, but I mean, he's just not a reliable receiver based on the numbers, from his career and just based on the usage that you see in practice as well. I think he's just not a guy that you really want to be relying on in a receiving role at tight end. And I mean, we watched James Bomba enough to know that he has made some plays, but I mean, he's been at IU for a long time now and has never really kind of taken that next step that people
Right.
had pegged him to take at some point. So I think the depth, I think this frankly is one of the thinnest rooms on the team in terms of position depth. And that if you had any injuries or any situations pop up with Stace or Nowakowski, it could cause some problems.
Yeah, and I think especially like kind of what you're saying, like if you Kowski, then I think as a blocking could potentially seriously suffer, and then you are talking about a situation where you're not as thrilled about the room as you were a year ago. One of our astute commenters at the Daily Hoosier pointed this out, and it kind of goes to what you've been saying the last couple minutes, and that is because and we could be wrong about this, but because it looks like Stays and Nowakowski have more distinct roles within the offense, will their presence on the field kind of be a tell for the other side?
Honestly, that's something I've wondered as well.
Yeah.
And I don't, I'm not sure how, the best way to answer that. I mean, you kind of picture it as maybe in formations you basically would have Nowakowski not lined up at the tight end spot, but more as a fullback where because he could be in the pass protection too. That's where the thing you kind of forget. It's not just blocking tight ends out there, they're running, receiving guys
Right.
out there, they're throwing. You can have Nowakowski out there in the pass pro as well, and so it may not be a dead giveaway tell, but certainly, I mean, if Holden Stace is on the field, I'd figure it's more likely than not that they're going to be throwing the ball. But I mean, I guess we'll have to. Time will tell, I guess, is the way to answer that question, and I'm sure that's something that Mike Shanahan has been thinking about all summer.
Yeah, I mean I think that was my response, is that basically if us dumb media and dumb fans are thinking about it, Indiana's thinking about it. um so let's talk about the other guys in the room. A couple freshmen that have come in. Andrew Barker is an Indiana product from Kokomo, Indiana, 3-star recruit, and Blake Thyre, I think is how you might be Theory, a 3-star from Wisconsin. I've watched him a little bit, Blake Theory, because he comes in with a reputation as a really good athlete, plays a lot of sports. And I think, I see some potential there. I don't think either one of these guys, beyond maybe special teams, are going to play much this year, except maybe in the early games, probably both red shirts, unless they suffer some injuries. But anything you've picked up watching those guys throughout fall camp and our limited access?
Frankly, not a ton that I've been able to see from them. It's such a small group, and I'd maybe I appropriate my time, elsewhere, more at practices. Not that I'm not paying attention to the tight ends, but I see a couple reps for Nowakowski and Stace, and then I kind of move on or something like that. But I
Right.
mean, I think you're right that it would be very surprising if either of these guys take the field this year. I mean, Kurt Signetti has mentioned some freshmen by name. When he's talked to the media, these are not guys that he's really brought up, in his press conferences. Which he does keep some things close to the chest, but I feel like we would have heard their names by now if they were really in any game plans going forward. I think obviously we'll see what the future holds for these two. I mean, you have you have a 6-year senior and you have a normal senior in Nowakowski and Stace, and James Bomba's gone after this year. You'd imagine they're probably going to go back to the transfer portal, after this season to bring in somebody with more experience. But I think it just feels like the opportunity isn't going to be there for these guys this year. And it's going to be next spring where we really will start to be able to evaluate them.
Yeah, no, that seems fair. I think I think it was interesting that they did bring in both Stays and Nowakowski during the offseason. Probably as much as anything, like you said, just depth in the room. Like they don't have a lot of numbers, but it would be interesting, and maybe we should have done some homework before this, but just to kind of go back and look at what Signetti's had in the past from tight ends. I know Horton was with him for a long time and was a primary guy for a couple of years, but I don't know, like, if he's had a Stays in the past and was trying to get back to that, because he could have thought, well, if I go get Nowakowski, I've kind of got what I need to keep the momentum going that they had with Horton. So it's like I said, it's one of the more intriguing things that I'm interested in watching in the early games of the season is how those two are utilized and how it changes the offense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's their roles, like Nowakowski and Stace, like their roles within the offense are probably two of the more like clearly defined individual roles on the team. But I think the usage and the importance to the team is probably one of the least known quantities on the team as a whole. So it's kind of an interesting balance there.
Right. Well, I think we can wrap it up right there. I think we're right around or just over our 30-minute mark where we're trying to keep these for one opponent, one position group.
We'll cut down on the tomfoolery next time.
What's that?
We'll cut down on the tomfoolery for next episode.
We'll try to. But if we make it 3 days in a row here, I will give us the credit that we've got some real momentum going here. We might actually get through this thing. So another notch in our credit for today. Try to do it again tomorrow as we'll cover the offensive line, and we'll go from there. So he is Seth Tao. I am Mike Schumann for the Daily Hoosier and East 17th Street. We will catch you all later.